BeachBody has a new 4-week gut protocol, and you best believe we're going to talk about it. The program is run by Autumn Calabrese here, and right off the bat, she introduces herself as an expert in nutrition, which I think is a pretty bold claim for someone who only has an online coaching certification. But then she goes on to say that she was someone who dealt with gas and bloating and constipation and all of these things, and do you resonate with that? Which of course, a lot of people are probably gonna say yes to, and says that she figured out this protocol because it worked for her, which is problem number one, because the mentality of it works for me, it's gonna work for you, is a huge red flag. So for 4 weeks, what you have to do is cut out alcohol, artificial sweeteners, corn, dairy, soy, gluten, and any gluten-free products. They said not even like gluten-free pasta you should try to avoid because they can be heavily processed and spike your blood sugar. I don't really know what that has to do with gut health, but that's just something they said. And then they also said you can avoid, but don't have to, eggs, nuts, and legumes. And then they say you should limit caffeine. You can have some, but you should limit it. But you should really, the main thing is add fermented foods to your diet. Okay. Plants, namely 30 different plants per week, which that's a lot. And then a vegan Shakeology, optimize and revitalize. Of course, BeachBody products, classic. And then it's also recommended that you pair this program with one of the BeachBody workouts. Now at face value, that doesn't sound that bad. You're probably thinking like, okay, but we have to dive into some important pieces here. Most notably, that gut issues like gas, bloating, and constipation are very often a symptom of under-eating or not eating enough calories. So your baseline treatment for that should actually be eating more calories to see if that heals your gut first. Once you've ruled out problem number one of potentially under-eating, then you could maybe do an elimination diet, but any elimination diet should always be very closely monitored by a professional, which of course this program isn't doing. And lastly, and arguably the most important point here, is that gut issues are almost always a side effect of eating disorders. And everything that Autumn lists, the gas, bloating, constipation, someone with an eating disorder is going to be like, yeah, that happens to me. I've got to heal my gut. But really, it's a result of their eating disorder. And she gives zero disclaimer of this. There's nothing anywhere saying, hey, you probably shouldn't do this if you have an eating disorder, or check with your doctor. There's nothing like that. So that's really, really concerning. And then, of course, it has you calculate calories. You can do maintenance or weight loss, but let's be honest, so many people are going to pick weight loss. And when I put my information in, it gave me 1,300 calories with the little portion fix containers, way too low. So it seems like this whole program is just a calorie restrictive diet targeted to a different group. In the spirit of talking about BeachBody, let's go over the 2B mindset. Now, I've addressed this one before, but after doing even more digging, reading their program outline sounds a lot like an early 90s diet book. Now, this program is run by a registered dietitian, and it starts off by saying, you should really prioritize veggies and protein on your plate. And it says that they don't restrict any foods, and you're like, oh, okay, so maybe that sounds pretty decent. But then when you actually start to read, they do restrict foods, and they do tell you what to eat in one way or another, but without using the stereotypical restrictive language. Here's what I mean. It gives you examples of what your plate should look like at each meal, but it says that you should always drink 16 ounces of water before every meal, which is basically eating disorder 101 if you ask me. Then after the dinner plate example, it says, remember, it should be dinner and done. And after dinner that you need to move on with your night. And when someone asked, well, what if I'm hungry in between meals, or what if I'm hungry after dinner? It essentially said that you should ignore it. It did the nice thing of saying like, well, first drink 16 ounces of water and see if you're still hungry. And then it said, check in and see if you're stressed or bored or all those things. And that's great. I want you to eat mindfully. But ultimately it said after dinner, that should be it. You shouldn't eat anything else, which is basically the fad diet motto. They then go on to tell you that there's a thing called silly carbohydrates. Now, these silly carbs and treats, they say you should really be careful because they might hinder weight loss. Foods on that list include things like bagels and coffee creamer, croissants, ice cream, frozen yogurt, tortilla chips, pretzels, alcohol. And they say, you can have them, but only if you track it. They then remind you that it's easier to eat things that you can track easily. So for example, have one cookie instead of a handful of chips. They then say, if you do have these silly carbs and treats, that might not be a weight loss day, but that's a decision that you'll just have to make. Continuing with the early 90s fad diet theme, they say that if you eat at a restaurant, you should eat from the skinny and light parts of the menu. They then sort of round things out by saying, hey, you don't have to finish your plate and stuff yourself, listen to your fullness cue, which great. Yeah, I'm totally on board with that. Listen to your fullness cue. But then with the restrictive language, they go on to say, hey, if you really do feel like you want to keep picking at your plate, remind yourself of these two quotes. Ready? It's better in the trash than on my body, or rather in the waste than on my waist. Early 90s diet book, my friends.